Hi, I'm Cliff, and this is my garage. Today, I'm going to show you how to remove and then reinstall the front strut on the Cayman. Hey, welcome back to the garage. And if this is your first time joining me, thanks for dropping by. Now, the footage in this video was originally shot as part of an episode on installing front camber plates on the Cayman. But when I started editing it together, I realized that removing the front struts was more of a general purpose task that was necessary for a host of other jobs. For example, replacing a defective front strut, or upgrading the stock struts to coilovers. You could also be installing lowering springs or replacing decayed bump stops, something that seems to be pretty common on the Caymans. In fact, these front bump stops are completely rotten, and I'll be replacing them when I upgrade the entire suspension soon. So I decided to break this footage out into its own episode. I'll be doing a separate episode on removing the rear struts, since that's a much more complicated job. Okay, let's get started. Now, you may have noticed this line of gaffer tape that I've put up here on the edge of the fender. Gaffer tape is like a fabric sort of duct tape, but it's stickier and it also leaves no residue when it comes off. Now, the reason for this is there is a chance that you can run into the edge of the fender with the top of the strut and scratch it up, but I'm going to show you another little trick that lets you pretty much avoid that, but I've done it anyway just to be absolutely sure. Step one is going to be to remove the brake caliper. And we're not going to like disconnect it from the brake line. We're just going to remove it from the wheel carrier and hang it off here to the side. Actually, step one would be to remove the brake pads out of here, but I've already done that. If you want to know or get a quick tutorial on how to do it, you can check out my video on world record brake pad change, and I'll give you a link up here in this corner. If you want a more detailed tutorial on how to change the brake pads, I'll give you up in the same corner a link to a different video I did, which is a highly detailed brake pad change video on the Cayman here. So we'll start by getting a few things disconnected. We'll start here with these connectors. Just take this thing, and there are two prongs here. You push them apart, pop it up, and there are two things that are plugging in here. This one here, I believe, is a wheel speed sensor. I'm not sure about that. We'll just disconnect that and set it to the side. The other one is the brake pad wear sensor. Now, there is a tendency on the track to melt these things. And so what a lot of people do is simply take and solder the two ends together and bundle it up like that. And it just makes a plug that so you have to now watch your pad depth or your pad thickness yourself, but you don't have to worry about, because you don't have to worry about false pad wear warnings, because like I said, the heat generated at the track is so intense, a lot of times it simply melts these. Even the stock Porsche sensors, much less the cheaper aftermarket ones. But we can leave that one plugged in, and you can't plug it into the wrong one. The two connectors are differently shaped. Now this sensor connector, let's just do that. Set it off to the side. I'm going to take this bolt, stick it over here on my magnetic tray that I've got stuck to the inside of the fender well. Now we need to break loose this hard line or brake line bracket here, where the hard line and the flexible line connect. And both this bracket and that first sensor hole connector are held on with 10mm bolts. So stick that one over there. So now we've got this loose. Let's get the caliper loose. Calipers themselves are held on with these T55 Torx bolts. Now, when we take this caliper off, we can't just let it hang by the brake. Well, you could just let it hang by the brake line, but it's probably not a good idea. And so, what normally I would do is take a piece of wire like this 12-2, yeah, 12-2 house wire, and just put it around the coils up here on the coil spring, which I don't think you can see. But since we're taking this out, I can't do that. So instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this wire here on the other side of these wires. It's like a little clip bracket here, and then come around behind these wires. Okay, now when the bracket is hanging on this, the force is on the bracket, not the wires themselves. I'm gonna move my magnetic tray. Those magnetic trays are fantastic. I'll give you a link to them down in the description below. Highly recommend them. So now we're ready to break this thing loose or remove it completely. Pull that bolt out. Just swing this around. Stick this wire through the caliper. There. Nice and out of the way. Next, we're going to remove this drop link that goes down to the anti-roll bar. And basically, there's a bolt that runs through the wheel carrier here, and on the other side here is a nut. Now, the problem is that if you start to try and remove that nut, that bolt just spins inside the wheel carrier. There's nothing on this end to keep it from spinning. However, there was like a hex connector or a hex. I don't know what you'd call it. There's a portion here that's shaped like a hex, like a bolt head of a bolt. The problem is that it's very, very thin, and a regular wrench will not go down in there. So what I'm going to use instead is a thin wrench, and I'll give you a link to the ones that I use. This will go in here easily and let you hold that bolt while you take the nut off on the other end. Now we just take a hammer and tap the bolt out. You might need to take and wiggle this back and forth a little bit to get it to walk out. The wire for this connector runs behind here. It pops into a bracket. Just take and push it and wiggle it straight back, and it'll come out of there. It's this little rubber piece fits onto like a slotted piece of metal. I don't know how to describe it. It looks a lot like these back here. And just take this and get it out of the way also. There. Now let's remove the tie rod end, and this one's again a little bit tricky because this bolt or the stud freely spins inside the wheel carrier. And so let me see if we can go ahead and break this loose. Oh, that wasn't bad. Okay, and here it's coming off just fine. The problem is after a while it's probably going to start spinning. Okay, well, turns out it's not. But if it did, what you'd need to do is take a let's see what this is, a T40 bit, and there's a Torx socket in the end of the stud there. And so you'd have to take and do like this to hold that stud from spinning while you take it off. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take and I'm going to loosen this up. And I'm going to get the nut up to where it's flush with the top of this, because we need to, again, hammer this out. And so by leaving the nut on there, you're going to prevent mushrooming the stud. But in this case, we've also got a Torx socket. So I'm going to put this Torx bit in here. Then I'm going to use the hammer on top of that. That way everything is protected. Oh, I almost screwed up. Okay, so the problem with this is when you've got the wheel pulled all the way out like this to get at it, it causes the bolt to bind inside the wheel carrier. So you've got to take and straighten the wheel up before you pull this thing out of there. There. Remove the nut. And there is our tie rod end. Just swivel that out of the way. Now, the last thing we need to do is one of those little tricks I was talking about, and that is to loosen up this bolt holding on the lower control arm. We don't want to remove it. We just want to loosen it up. And what that does, it lets the lower control arm drop down lower than it normally would, which makes it much easier for this entire thing to drop down and give us clearance to get the top of the strut out of the fender without having to compress the springs or do any other kind of tricks. Now, obviously, this is a super tight area. I can't actually video me removing or loosening it because all you'd see is my back. So just trust me, I'm going to loosen that. Now, there is a bolt on the other, or rather a nut on the other end. Sometimes it sticks well enough to where you don't have to try and hold it with a wrench. Sometimes you need to hold the other end. It just depends. I've loosened up that lower control arm bolt, and you can see how much extra room it gave me. This was up against the stop collar, and once I loosened that bolt, the wheel carrier came down. What is that? An inch and a quarter. That makes a huge difference in trying to get the strut out of the wheel well without running into the lip of the wheel well. Before we cut the strut loose, we need to get some support underneath the wheel carrier so that it just doesn't all flop down. And so I've taken a floor jack and I've put it underneath the wheel carrier. Now this is important. I've seen people do this where they take and they put the pad of the jack underneath the bottom of the rotor here. But the problem is if you get pressure there, if you get a little bit off, it can suddenly shoot to the side because this is free to spin. So don't put it under the rotor. Put it underneath the wheel carrier back here. Also notice that I've pushed the wheel carrier back to where the wheel carrier is now making contact with the stop collar again to make sure this is all compressed back together and supported. We've opened up the hood and I need to remove this panel right here. And so to do that, I've got to release the battery cover. Just get that loose. You don't have to completely remove it. And then same thing here, this piece of side trim, just kind of pull that aside. And this now comes up and you got to kind of wiggle it past, pushing the windshield washer fluid tank lid forward a bit to get it out of there. And now here is the top of our strut. And you can hopefully see the 3 bolts right here that need to be removed. So now we're looking here at the strut top, and this is the best view I can get you because it's just such tight, cramped quarters. Now, if you don't have PASM on your car, then you don't need to worry about the stuff I'm about to do here. If you don't have this wire coming out, you don't have PASM, and if you don't have PASM, you don't have this wire coming out. But if you do have PASM, then we need to get this disconnected. Let's start by just popping this cap out here. It's split, so it comes right off. I'll set that aside. And now we need to deal with this wire. And goes into this little clip here that's just holding it. And then the connector is buried down inside here. And I'll try to get you photos of this stuff. It's this connector is held in like a clip, and it's really hard to see how it comes apart. Basically, it's like a clamshell, and you need to reach down in here and get hold of the lip. And, Lord, what a pain! And pop it loose. There. Now, once you get that thing out of there, you can pull the connector up, and you can see, hopefully, there's like a little clip on one side that you have to pull up, and then the connector slides out. And this thing is a big old pain in the butt. I just try and jam my fingernail in there and pull it up. There. And in case I forget to say this when I'm putting it back together, this connector appears that it goes either way. It's one side or the other. It doesn't matter. Okay, so we've got the PASM connector broken loose, and now we need to remove these 3 nuts here, and our strut is ready to go. These are 13 millimeters. My battery's getting low. Yeah. Oh, it's barely. Come on. Oh, all right. Do that one by hand. Despite its battery running out, that DeWALT impact driver is one of the best tools I've ever bought. I highly, highly recommend that. Okay, we're ready to drop this down. Let's get our PASM wire clear where it can come out easily, and let's do this. Okay, so now that we've got this all cut loose, we're just going to take and slowly lower the jack down while holding the strut and working it out of the fender. All right, I'm going to stop. Go ahead and pull the PASM wire through so I don't have to worry about it. And now I'm just going to lower this down. Okay, I'm going to stop it right there. And now I'm going to bring it back up. Okay. Now, if you want to pull this thing out and work on it on a bench, I just like to leave it in there and work on it right here. Actually, a little bit lower. There. I like to work on it right here, but if you want to pull this out and put it on a bench and work on it, just kind of wiggle it some, and it comes right out of the wheel carrier. But I like to work on it here, so let's put it back. As I was saying, the top of the strut looks a little different if you have a non-PASM strut. Now, of course, on a PASM strut, naturally you have the PASM wire. That's obvious. But the difference is in the shaft, the top of the shaft, and then this washer. On a non-PASM, this washer is, I think it's smaller, but it's flat. And then the strut, or the stud coming up, the end of the shaft, it doesn't have a hole for the wire. What it does have is it has a Torx socket, so that you can put a Torx bit in there, like the end of the tie rod, so that you can hold the shaft while taking this nut off here. On the PASM version, you can't do that because they needed someplace to bring the wire up. So instead, what they did was they put on this big dished washer, and they sell two Porsche has two special tools. One is to hold this washer, because the washer is keyed into the shaft, so that by holding this washer still, you've immobilized the shaft, and then they have another special tool to go on here and um, do the get the nut off while going around the wire. Well, if you've been watching this channel for any amount of time, you know I'm not even sure Porsche will sell you those tools, but even if they do, I hate buying tools that only have one purpose. And I can't even imagine what Porsche charges for those tools. So I came up with a workaround on that. I found that a pipe wrench works perfectly for grabbing hold of that washer and keeping the shaft from turning while you take the nut off. And then to take off the nut, I just use a 21 millimeter end wrench, but it's an offset end wrench, so that you just slide it in over the PASM wire, and it works great. It reaches down into the gap. Now, if you had a um, very thin pipe wrench, you could probably get it with a regular one, or if you just want to work with a regular end wrench out here and just keep doing this, especially if you've got a 21 millimeter ratchet, that may work really well. Now, the way that I like to do it is by using this oxygen sensor wrench or socket, and it has a slot in it to go over the wire. And then you can just use this. The wire will turn and twist in there and keep it, it won't damage the wire. Now, this is a oxygen sensor socket. So it's actually 22 millimeters, but it's close enough and it works. If you can find one of these at 21 millimeters, great. Now, before we actually remove this, we need to deal with the spring tension, because you don't want to remove this nut and then have it like all these pieces just go springing off all over the garage. And yes, that is the technical term, springing. So I like to, or we need to use something like or use a spring compressor that's going to take and grab hold of the spring coils and pull them together and relieve the tension here off of this top mount. There are various styles. I like these because they're very sturdy. They don't, there's other kinds you can buy that are less expensive, but they tend to like start bending under a lot of pressure. These I feel are much safer and they work better. And I'll give you a link to these that I use in the video description below. So we just don't need to pull these in a whole lot, because we don't need to, there's not a whole lot of pressure on it right at the moment. So let me just get this. It's a little clumsy to get these in place. These could be designed a little better. And then you tighten up. There's a nut on the bottom down that you can't see. And these things here are for a bar that ties the two of them together. For this type of a spring, you can't do that. All right, get this clamped down good. Get the top set. And then I'll use an impact wrench to pull them together. Okay, and as you can see, the spring is now loose. Get our pipe wrench set. Let the pipe wrench bite in, and then okay. We'll remove this nut here. Then, come on.
One eternity later.
Okay, I don't know what just happened there. This thing would not come off. It's like as if the bushing lining had like bimetal welded or galled onto here. I had to end up taking and going through the spring underneath here with a long, heavy-duty screwdriver and just pounding this thing off. Kind of messed up the threads a little bit, but what I did was afterwards just took and put the nut on, and then I would run it on and then back it out, just slowly working my way down and letting the nut reform the threads. Whew. I have never seen that happen before. Normally it just comes right off. Okay, let's put this back together. Now, the spring here, you can see there's an end right here. See it in the camera? There's an end of the spring, and it's on the other side here, but there is a definite like step, and that is where that spring end goes. So you need to get that properly in position. Just bump it up against that step. And then here's the upper part. This is the spring seat and the bearing. So there's a ball bearing in there. And it probably isn't really all that critical, but I think you can see there's a little indentation. Boy, that thing is slippery. There's a little indentation here where this end of the spring was. It probably doesn't matter, but I just like to check and make sure I keep that lined up. Okay, so let's put this new camber plate on. Put this back on. Turn that back on. Get my pipe wrench again. Tighten this down. All right, so I got that tightened up. Now I'm going to take and I'm going to use the torque wrench to torque this down to the 59 foot-pound spec. There. Now we can release the springs and put this back in. Double checking our spring seats here before we release them. Okay, so let's put this back down a little bit to give ourselves the clearance we need. Now, this is where the fun starts because you have to be, this actually be easier as a two-person job, but it's not bad as one person. Just need to get this started. Let me go ahead and get my PASM wire up in there. And as you lift this, at first it'll look like it's not going to go in there, but as you lift this, the whole thing swings inward. You can line it up right. And when you get close, now for your final point of setting it in there, here's the real trick. You got to set your jack at about a 45-degree angle. Then come in here. This will have kind of flopped over, so turn it and get the bolts kind of lined up. And then push down with your foot. Slowly, keeping an eye on all three bolts. Just kind of finagling things around. There.
At this point, you need to put the nuts back onto the top studs. Also, reconnect the PASM wire and secure it back into the clips. I forgot to video these tasks. Don't forget to do them. They're kind of important.
The next thing we really need to do is get back in there to the that bolt for the lower control arm. We need to tighten that back up. Now, I know I've said many times before that if you're going to work on cars, you really need a torque wrench. And in fact, you not only need a torque wrench, I think you need multiple torque wrenches. I have 3 different torque wrenches, and this is a perfect example of why I do. In this case, this head on this one is so big and fat, it can't get back in there. The bolt is very tight up against the suspension member, and there's just not room. So I'm going to be using my medium torque wrench. Now this one, it's another Tekton. This will not do as high of a torque as the other, but it'll fit places like this where the other one will not. That lower control arm bolt has a 16mm head and an 18mm nut. You're going to need to get the nut because it will spin on you. And I've set the torque range to 89 foot-pounds. Now, the scale only goes to 80 foot-pounds, but the barrel scale goes to 80 foot-pounds. But you just keep going with the handle scale here to get up to 89. Now, just like before, I can't show you because I can't get a camera back in here. Or I could maybe get a GoPro, but we know how unreliable GoPros are, right? One big disadvantage of this smaller torque wrench is that it doesn't have as long of a lever, so it's harder to generate 89 foot-pounds than it would be with the other one. I've got the other wrench jammed in place so I can use both hands on this one. There we go. Now let's do the tie rod end. Tighten this down as much as I can. Okay, it's probably spinning on me now. I don't know. That didn't really feel like it was spinning. Our tie rod end is 56 foot-pounds. Next, we're going to go for the drop link bolt. I don't know if I mentioned it. The tie rod torque was 56 foot-pounds. We're here on the drop link, and that's 63 foot-pounds. 17mm skinny wrench to get it on the other end of this bolt here. Now we can tighten it down. I've turned the wheel back so that we can get at this easier, and using that T55 Torx bit to reset the calipers. And then we torque these up to 63 foot-pounds. Then we set the screws for the 2 brackets. And this is the reason for the third torque wrench, because this is in inch-pounds, and this is what you need to set really low torques. In this case, these bolts are spec'd to 7.5 foot-pounds or 90 inch-pounds, which isn't much at all, and the bigger torque wrenches won't go down that low. So that's what this little beauty is for. The speed sensor wire back into here, clip it down, and then clip this wire back here into its bracket again. And that's all there is to it. All that's left is to set the camber to the spec you want by loosening those top mount nuts and sliding the strut back and forth in the slotted holes. Now you can either use the standard factory setting of negative 0.25 degrees or maybe something more aggressive for track use. Just keep in mind that if you change the camber from the factory setting, you'll also need to adjust the toe in. Camber changes make the entire front wheel assembly rotate, so your toe end is going to be off if you use something other than the factory setting. Now, you can have a shop set your camber for you as part of a normal front end alignment, or you can do it yourself. Now, if you want to go the DIY route, this 10 holes in camber caster gauge makes it extremely easy. I especially like the fact that it's self-calibrating. Unless your floor is not level, you can just use it instead of having to zero it out every time. Although you can do that if you need to. It's really well made and I highly recommend it. I'll give you an Amazon link to it in the video description below. It's a bit pricey, but if you do like just 2 alignments yourself, you'll more than cover the cost. I'm going to be doing a video on full DIY alignments in the near future. I have my own method that's highly accurate, and unlike all the other videos I've seen, it works with cars like the Cayman where the front and the rear tracks are different widths. Now, before you go, make sure to go down there and smack that like button to let YouTube know that you enjoyed this episode. And if you're not one of my subscribers, I sure hope today was the day that I earned your subscription. It's totally free and it really helps me grow the channel. And finally, if you want to keep up with all the stuff going on here in the garage, like Project 987.2, where I'm about to do an absolutely massive upgrade to the Cayman suspension, go click on that bell icon. That turns on notifications for this channel, and that way YouTube will let you know every time that I post something new from here in Cliff's Garage. I'll see you next time.